here. Perfect. Okay, awesome. So yeah, 102, we'll get started. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us at the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics panel. This panel is about post-secondary education, tuition levels, and all of that fun stuff. I'll kindly ask everybody in attendance to please mute your microphone while the discussion panel is while it's underway. And I also want to note that this panel is hosted by POLIS. It is the representative body for the Political Science and International Studies Department. This panel will be moderated by two of our executive members, myself and Bronwyn Heerspink. Our fellow executive members, Caitlin Kowalchuk and Catherine Pamasaran, send their regrets as they're unable to attend today. My name is Alanna DeCorby. I am a philosophy, politics, and economics student in my 4th year. I'm writing an undergraduate honors thesis in political science, and this is my 1st year on POLIS. I am the secretary. I will now pass it over to Bronwyn to introduce our panelists today.
First hiccup of the event, I forgot to unmute myself. So thanks, Alanna. So hi, everybody. My name is Bronwyn Heerspink. I am a 2nd-year political science honors student, and I'm concurrently working towards my certificate in economics. So I guess that would make me 2/3 of a PPE major. So this is also my 1st year on POLIS. I hold the position of events coordinator, and I will be leading the discussion and question period after we hear each of our panelists this afternoon. We invite active participation from all in attendance and look forward to a robust discussion on the future of post-secondary education. But I'm going to ask everybody to please hold their questions until the Q&A period. Our event today includes 3 panelists: Dr. Roger Petry, Professor of Philosophy at Luther College, Dr. Tom McIntosh, Professor of Political Science at the University of Regina, and Dr. Carmen Dybwad, Professor of Economics at the University of Regina. The professors will give a more in-depth introduction of themselves at the beginning of their presentations. And they will commence in the following order, beginning with Dr. Petry, moving on to Dr. McIntosh, and concluding with Dr. Dybwad. With that, we will pass the virtual mic over to Dr. Petry to begin his presentation.
Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides and hear me. Maybe give me a thumbs up if that's the case. Okay, so I'm a philosophy professor at Luther College. I also do quite a bit of work in the area of sustainable development, and I'll mention a bit about that a little later. I'm just going to start my timer so I stay within my 10 minutes here as well. Okay, so I guess when I looked at the topic for today, I tried to frame the question. And so it seemed to be talking about the future of post-secondary education and the role of tuition in that future. So in looking at the question as a philosopher, it seemed to me there were 4 ways we might take it. One way was looking at it as a kind of a transactional model. And I know Carmen will be talking a lot about sort of the economics of tuition. Looking at it from an educational perspective with student as kind of a scholar within a larger community, looking at student as citizen, broader citizen, and I know Tom will talk a bit about that as well, and then a kind of general capabilities approach and students in terms of sustaining broader livelihoods. So in terms of the first one, kind of a transactional model, it really sees education in a kind of an instrumental sort of a way. And it also sees the university and the student as kind of coming to sort of an arrangement or in a contract. And so there is that perspective too. It struck me, first of all, if we're thinking of this transactionally, if we're talking about what economic value is provided to students, it's more than just tuition, all right? So we need to think about the broad set of costs that students incur when they embark upon a post-secondary education. And really, it seems to me that universities are more likely to be able to provide financial benefits to students by reducing costs in the other areas. And so already I know that the university is working on open educational resources. It's looking at trying to reduce the costs of our infrastructure, so we presumably don't have to charge as much elsewhere. The ability to gather donations for students in terms of bursaries and so on. I think in the long run, I think the universities actually have to work on a digital currency, because there we could then provide additional employment for students, even if we were limited in other areas to provide a financial return. The other thing is we do have historically low interest rates, and I think that has a bearing on the tuition. What is the overall cost of this tuition 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road? The question, though, is it a fair return on investment, given the uncertainty in terms of future employment? I think historically, universities are economically counter-cyclical. So the idea that people come to university when the economy might not be as good as it otherwise is. But a question we could ask, well, what if this cycle is broken? So what about disruptions economically with automation, politically with democratic collapse, COVID-19, climate change? I mean, I guess it would be a viable worry. Is there a possible return? On the flip side, I think universities of all institutions are most resilient in terms of some of these crises. Why? Well, because we have a broad range of knowledge that we can apply to our biological issues, our social systems, economic systems. If there's a new model of business that is going to be viable in these changing times, probably universities have a role there, because we share resources and we might have models that can succeed. And the ability to reduce future costs of students in other areas. So perhaps as universities, we can provide new models that reduce people's future housing costs or food costs, because we've trained you in new ways. And that's an actual financial benefit. If we see university, though, not just instrumentally, but having intrinsic value, I think that's, as philosophers, we would emphasize that, you know, the ability to discover answers to the best questions, whether or not they provide a future benefit in some way. And here students aren't seen as some separate from the university in a contracting relationship. Here universities are seen as members of the scholarly community and peers. And so the ability of tuition to go towards answering those best questions, whether it's theoretical or applied, is really important. But I guess students might say, well, tuition, no taxation without representation. What do we get out of it? Well, universities have already been restructured, right? Go back to the earliest universities in Europe, where students demanded that professors finish their courses, complete things, that as professors, we have responsibilities for teaching public research, service, students participate in collegial governance. And in a way, tuition may be seen perhaps as a kind of professional dues, something like that. And of course, students historically have a role in defending the university in crisis, particularly if there are cuts to funding. I think students have that role as well. There's also the political model, and I think if we think about students and universities as promoting personal dignity that undergirds citizenship. And so here we are in a space with academic freedom, freedom of thought and speech, that really is a bulwark to our modern democratic institutions. And so thinking about how our collegial governance models the kind of governance we should have in our broader democracy that is evidence-based, right? I think one of the challenges nowadays is that the public discourse around many things has lost that commitment to rational standards, whereas a university can always be a touchstone for that. And so thinking about tuition as a way of preserving the autonomy of the university, because we're not entirely dependent on our patrons, whoever those are, whether it's government or business or what have you, universities relying on tuition is one way in which we keep our independence. And also the ability of students to reflect on what has most value as citizens, so they can direct our institutions, our political institutions, as citizens. And so one of the key things we need us to see the universities as are independent. All right, so I always think of us more like the law courts. We don't serve any particular government. We serve citizens in general over the long term. And so to what extent are we able to sustain ourselves through time to ask those questions that maybe take 30 years, 50 years, 200 years to answer? And how do we generate kind of a wise citizenry? The last model I want to just look at briefly is a kind of a capability model. And the ability to sustain our systems over the long term, our natural systems and our human systems. And part of the reason is because as universities and scholars, we take our inspiration from nature and from society. And so the ability to create modern living laboratories means sustaining our communities. Also, we as universities need to care about our societies being in surplus from a resource perspective so that we have those surplus resources for these types of long-term questions that are really, really important. Education provides a general benefit to everybody. We don't know who benefits in the end necessarily. And so the fact that there's kind of a collective responsibility here. So what is the role of tuition there? Well, I think our current systems of production and consumption are not particularly sustainable and that we need to make fairly substantial changes to them. And so in a way, tuition and other contributions students make to the scholarly process will allow us in the next few years to transform campuses to be more sustainable in terms of production and consumption for our own self-sufficiency. But I think it's also important to see how universities can generate the kinds of transformative technologies that transform the wider society into more sustainable pathways, particularly around climate change and other issues. Well, why is that so important from a tuition perspective? Well, because in the end, we can develop the new sustainable livelihoods and lifestyles on our campuses that students can then take out to the broader society, but also sustain themselves in the long-term future as well. And so we need to see tuition as that investment, not only in terms of individual success, but in terms of the wider society's ability to be sustainable over the long term. And so I think tuition there is quite critical too. Anyway, those were the four lenses I thought we could answer the question through, but I am done. And so thank you for giving me the chance to speak to you today.
Thanks so much. We'll move on to Dr. McIntosh now. If you have slides, feel free to bring those up.
Tom, do you still want me to go first? Oh, no, apparently not.
Why don't you go first, Carmen? Because it would, yeah, I think it makes more sense giving what's in your slides and what's in my slides.
Okay, perfect. Then we'll move on to Dr. Dybwad.
Yeah, the rabble is taking over. Yeah, see what happens. Okay, so I'm gonna. Now, Tom, do you have to stop your screen sharing because that's what I'm seeing on my?
Yes, there we go.
Okay, perfect. All right.
You'd think we'd never done this before.
Well, yeah, that's the way I feel about pretty much everything I do these days. It feels like I haven't. I'm doing it for the first time. Okay. So taking a look at post-secondary education and tuition from the economics lens is my claim to fame. Oh yes, I guess I was supposed to do a little intro first. So this is, I'm not a professor, I'm just on contract. This is basically my retirement gig. I went out and made my money in the private sector. And now I'm just whiling away my early retirement years by torturing you all. So the nice thing is, though, is that in terms of teaching PPE, is it gives me the opportunity to continue to learn new things because let's face it, I worked in the oil and gas industry I know pretty much nothing about post-secondary education, let alone tuition. So it's kind of compelled me to learn something new. So I just want to be the poster child for you never stop learning. How's that for a sales pitch? Okay, so why are we discussing free tuition? I decided to take to narrow down my perspective to free tuition, since I'm assuming that that's pretty much why you guys floated this out as something that you wanted to talk about. So the thing that I guess the first question you have to ask is there a problem, okay, or is free tuition just you guys wanting to, students deciding that if I can find somebody else to pay for it, that would be really great. Well, everything in life would be wonderful if that was the case. So is the free tuition just a solution in search of a problem, or is there actually a problem that would warrant us taking a serious look at this kind of policy? So in other words, is there a market failure that would warrant government intervention into post-secondary into the post-secondary education market? You know, so market failure, to paraphrase my good friend Jaya, who's on this, is like, we're just going to economics the hell out of this going forward for the next 10 minutes or so. Okay, so is there a problem? Is there a market failure? In economic terms, market failure occurs when the forces of supply and demand lead to an inefficient outcome, okay? And there are 5 main sources of market failure, but the one that we're going to be the most interested in is something called externalities. And in this case, it's going to be a positive externality. And that's the case where, if you will, the social benefits of an activity are much greater than the private benefits that accrue to the individual. So in other words, an individual who's making a decision in that marketplace is weighing their costs and benefits. But the thing is that there's a positive spillover effect that they're not considering. That's that social benefit. So when we take a look at the arguments for free university tuition, that's the principal one that we're going to see. It's the positive externalities of education to the economy. There are, of course, other benefits, equality, everyone can gain access, and that is probably, in this day and age, it's probably as great a driver or an argument for increasing or decreasing tuition fees, because social mobility is kind of stuck right now, and because of that we're getting increasing income disparity or inequality, and providing greater access to education can be a way to get around that problem or to mitigate it in some ways. The debt problem, of course, is an issue that you see more in the States probably than here. Here, again, as we do the whole economics thing, enables that high-tech economy. Basically, it's the sort of increased education is really part and parcel of increasing human capital, which we all know of in terms of growth theory is incredibly important. You're not going to have the skills that we're going to need going forward if you don't have a more educated population. So you really want to be able to increase that access. Of course, and then there's the non-economic benefits, such as increased political involvement. I think it was 2012, studies out of Vanderbilt basically found that, yes, an increased education level is an indicator of more political involvement. And, if you want to go a step further and listen to what Jefferson said, I mean, basically the cornerstone of any democracy rests upon an educated electorate. So there's all kinds of real great benefits. Now, are there arguments against it? Absolutely. And again, one of them would be the opportunity cost. That's always the question that you have to ask. If I don't do this, what else am I going to do with the money? And certainly the interdependence issues are also a concern that we're going to see a little later. In other words, there are going to be some negative impacts that need to be considered if you're talking about free tuition. Now, if you're talking about those returns, certainly if you want to look at McMahon, this is about 2007 or 9 that they did this study, you can actually see that there is actually a return to society per graduate. So those marginal social benefits absolutely occur, and some of them you can actually put dollar values to, and the things that you can't put a dollar value to but are non-zero are, you know, less inequality, which we just talked about, increased social capital, and of course the new ideas in terms of R&D feeding back into that growth theory again. So governments intervening in the marketplace, though, are going to erode price signals. You know that that's the case. Anytime that governments meddle or intervene in the markets, they are going to disrupt those price signals, okay? And those price signals are what we use to deal with scarcity. What kind of interference or what kind of outcome are we talking about here in terms of governments or interfering? Well, we know that basically if we're capping tuition at 0, which is a free, that's a price ceiling. And the issues that you get with price ceilings are shortages within the marketplace and a reduction in terms of quality, among other things. So you want to keep those things in mind when you're actually putting into consideration this kind of a policy. Okay, so we know that when you have governments intervening in a marketplace that you're going to have some loss in efficiency. For those of you that do have economics 100 or otherwise, you know that that's a dead weight loss. And we want to be able to minimize that. So if you're starting to see a pattern here, it's that sense that basically as you're going to go through, your policy design is going to be incredibly important going forward. With so many competing priorities, is increased subsidization of education worth it? In other words, are the benefits, you know, that we've just talked about, do they exceed the cost? And the answer would be yes. And there's more than a little bit of evidence that suggests if you have well-targeted education spending, it can pay for itself and yield increased benefits in the long run. The marginal value of public funds is, if it's greater than 1, then of course you want to proceed with the program. And the increased benefits, of course, in terms of being able to pay for themselves, means that as people are better educated and make more money, because we have got a progressive tax system, your tax revenues would actually increase. You get a fiscal externality associated with it as well. So the benefits will actually accrue to society for increased education and not just to the individual that is earning the degree. Now, are there problems? Yep, and I'm not going to belabor these. They're here. The slides will be available to anybody that wants them, but you have to remember that you can get some unintended consequences. So, for example, in Chile, where they had free tuition, it increased demand at selective programs, making those programs more competitive and pushing them out of reach for many low-income students that would have otherwise qualified. You would recognize that as a crowding out effect. Or, and I think the other one, this one was a study done in Princeton, that you found that if you expanded access, for example, just to 2-year programs, that boosts educational attainment for 2-year program entrance, but it diverted students from 4-year programs. Okay, so in other words, it was changing the relative markets, and that was not necessarily a positive. You really wanted people perhaps more in the 4-year programs than just in the 2-year programs. So positive social benefits, they've been recognized, you know, they've been recognized for a long time. Remember that even in K to, well, there wasn't kindergarten, grade 1 to grade 12, we now have public school, and it's been supported through taxation from, give or take, the mid 1800s. So it does exist. We already provide some free education. We already intervene, for example, in the post-secondary market. You know, we already subsidize your education. Okay, so it's not really a question of whether they should, it's now just a question of that additional intervention. Okay, so the key takeaway is that in terms of that intervention, you actually have to look at it as an investment in terms of the future. And this is probably where it gets to be a little bit of a harder sell, because of course the costs are occurring now. The benefits, as Roger has talked about, we don't see for years to come. And of course, you know, human beings, when you kind of separate that that reward from the spending, it's we're not so inclined to look that far down the road. That's a problem. So increased access to and participation in education is both economically and socially desirable. Increased participation in post-secondary education will not likely happen unless you do have some government intervention. The challenge is going to be to design that market intervention so that you reduce any of the downsides, the dead weight loss, or the negative interdependencies that can happen, okay? And we want them to be effective in meeting societal goals. Because remember, the goal isn't to have free education. There's another goal in addition to that. In other words, we want more people to have access to and have a better education. So it's going to be the design stupid, is the paraphrase from the Clinton era. Okay, so now I'm trespassing over into Tom's area because, you know, I can't help myself. So hopefully I'm just going to go quickly through this. This will be the setup for the political science portion of the show. So if we're going to do policy design, okay, which is the political science portion, remember economics is basically the language of policy, what principles are we going to apply? Well, first off, we got to take a look at what the goal is, because if you don't have a goal, you know, for argument, we're just going to say here that the goal of free education is to increase the number of students who complete a four-year degree. Okay, making university free is simply a means to that end. So it's important to ease the financial burden of students who are already going to attend university, but lower prices for students who already plan to attend is secondary. We just want to get more people through university. So the ideal policy should generate the largest amount of educational attainments, including degree completion per dollar spent. You want to get bang for your buck. So when you're taking a look at the next principle, you want to focus on the supply side. So sadly, that doesn't mean that we cut a check to everybody who wants to go to university. We're talking about basically funding it through the institutions. So the impact of any free tuition policy should not be measured in terms of attendance, but in terms of persistence and degree completion. So this gets rid of that problem that you might have where, wow, if I go to university, it's free and I'm just going to sit there and, you know, not show up in class and just basically just take up space. You want to be able to guard against that. So you're going to have to build in something that's going to make sure that people persist in terms of their degrees and that they actually complete them at the end. So increasing college completion rates will require more than free tuition. You're going to need scholarships and tuition reductions to address the financial burden. I think Roger talked about that too. But you want to do so that but they do not directly increase. Those things get to your attainment, but they don't necessarily speak to the quality issue. And we want to make sure that you get a good quality information, education, because remember before, one of the issues with the price ceiling is that you can get quality, drops in quality in terms of the market. So free university policies should provide tuition support as part of their broader package of reforms, and they should directly address the funding and governance of public institutions. Now, public institutions, though, are going to actually, you're going to have to continue to watch them because you're going to need strings attached. And this is particularly true in terms of institutions that might have a profit motive, because the issue might be that as they're getting the dollars to support the free tuition, that they're actually going to end up cutting down on the quality of some of the other things that they provide, okay? Because those subsidies are part of the educational experience, if you will, and you don't want those reduced, because if you reduce those, then you're reducing the quality. And if there's any sort of a sense that universities are going to want to cut down on those experiences and that quality, to make up for, the tuition fees that they're now not getting, that's a real problem. Okay, you don't want the quality to actually suffer going forward. So of course, basically somebody's going to have to instill some sort of discipline, or the strings are going to have to be attached in terms of the institution to make sure that they don't reduce those things as well. Okay, I've probably gone longer than my 10 minutes, so I will stop right there, because that's all teeing up for our friend Tom over here to take it away.
You got to see my conclusion there briefly before my setup. I'm Tom McIntosh. I'm a professor of politics and international studies, and I'm rejoining, I guess, PPE in the winter term as the political scientist in the group. I should let you know I'm not like Carmen. I'm not a post-secondary education policy person. I'm a health policy person. And so I sort of dove in on this. I too sort of narrowed it down to this debate that we've seen around free tuition and the like. And I'm going to take a related but somewhat different take than Carmen, because rather than try to think through what would you have to do to have free tuition and make it work, my argument is essentially free tuition is in fact the wrong solution to the right problem of access and the like. And then in fact, we should leave that aside and think about other policy areas and policy reforms. So let's see if we can get this work. Basic argument. I will concede, I think, that universities are currently over-reliant on tuition to fund operations, and I think this has negative consequences for both students and universities. We've all seen, especially in this province of light, significant annual increases in tuition. I think tuition still plays an important role in post-secondary education, but I don't see free tuition as necessarily increasing access, and certainly not giving greater access to less well-off students, which seems to be, from the sort of political argument, most often, and Carmen alluded to this, most often made for the case for free tuition. It's all about increasing access, improving equity, and the like. And there, I'll start my timer now. So I got a minute free. And finally, I think PSE needs to be rebalanced with a greater direct support from government. Tuition should play a smaller role than it does, but I wouldn't think, but I don't think necessarily eliminating it will help. It won't solve the problem that it's been identified as solving. And in fact, to go to some of what Roger said, I think it has some other negative consequences for the students' role and their voice and the like on campuses. What is our over-reliance on tuition? Well, in 2009-10, tuition was 32% of the University of Regina's revenue. A decade later, it's 43% of the University of Regina's revenue. Why is that? Well, I think you can directly tie it to the fact that the government grant has shrunk in that same time period from being 58% of our revenue to...
Tom, your slides aren't coming through.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
All I've got, and I'm assuming everybody else is, it says that you're sharing them, but I know you've got slides and they're not
Okay, let's try this again then. Do you see it?
Yep, you're good now.
Okay. There we go. So I'll keep going from, as I said, we've seen the increase in the reliance on tuition at the U of R go from 32 to 43. And this is, I would say, entirely because the government grant has shrunk from 58 to now less than half of our revenue. And I wish I'd had that stat at my fingertips when I was in a Twitter argument with somebody who says I should stop talking because I'm on the public dime. It seems I'm not nearly as much on the public dime as I used to be. I'm more on the public nickel because we're down to less than half. This, I think, drives universities to do two things. Ever increasing enrollments, and I think we've seen this at U of R. We have this fascination with ever increasing enrollments, more bums in seats, and we need more bums in seats because the place won't operate unless we continue to get more bums in seats. I think that has some negative consequences, or can have negative consequences, as class sizes increase and there are more and more call on the resources of the university. It also forces us to start looking for other sources of revenue, user fees, the contracting out of services, all of which can impact the quality of education, or possibly increasingly looking to the private sector to come up with money for the universities. And sometimes that may or may not come with conditions that are antithetical to what universities think they should be doing and what the traditional mission of what the university has been. And I think Roger touched a little bit on that, about the need to preserve that independence of the university. So let's look at a couple of the myths around what I think are myths around the free tuition debate, at least as it's played out in the newspapers and the like. First is that free tuition would increase access. If it was free, then just more people would be able to come. Interestingly, and all of the data I've got here comes from Alex Usher's Higher Education Strategies Associates. He's one of the sort of better post-secondary education consultants and thinkers around. So as of 2018, 61% of Canadians in 25 to 34 had some form of post-secondary education under their belt. And yet Sweden, Finland, and Germany, all countries with free tuition strategies, have much lower participation rates in post-secondary education. So the obvious idea that opening it up doesn't seem necessarily to hold. Similarly, the proportion of 20 to 34-year-olds in university whose parents are university educated, and this goes to Carmen's point about stagnant class mobility and the idea that, you know, how many of you are the first person in your family to go to university? I was the first person in my family to go to university, and then I wouldn't leave. But if you look at Norway and Denmark, both free tuition countries, in fact, they're educating the children of the educated. That there's much less access for people. In the United States, it's actually it's 58%. I could not find a figure, a direct figure for this in Canada. I wouldn't suspect that we're much different. So again, this seems to say that just by itself, free tuition doesn't seem to open up access. And I think that part of this is that tuition is not necessarily the major barrier to access to university. In fact, tuition may be the thing that funds more seats in universities. Also, free tuition in and of itself may trigger certain gatekeeping strategies by universities to limit enrollment. so standards go up and requirements like to get into particular programs rise because cost is or at least tuition costs have been completely eliminated, and we don't want to be teaching 400 students in every class. And so we begin to put up gatekeeping kinds of strategies. So again, in and of itself, tuition may not have the impact on access that we think it would. The other part of this is often that, you know, we talk about student debt loads and that free tuition would eliminate student debt. Again, I wish I had slightly more up-to-date figures, but I wasn't able to find them. But if you look at this, the percentage of after-tax earnings for graduates required to service their student loan debt is about the same as it was in the early 1990s. And part of this is because interest rates are really low. And so the cost of borrowing money, even if students and new graduates aren't getting the best interest rates, you're not getting the interest rates that I got when I graduated a few decades ago, let's just say. So again, it's not clear. The other part of this, of course, is that student loans are not just loans for tuition. They're loans for living expenses. And those would continue whether tuition is free or not. You still have to eat, you still have to pay rent, you still have to clothe yourself and the like. And so again, it sort of points to the fact that maybe we should be focusing on other things like, are there good jobs out there in the summer for students to be able to earn the money they need for living expenses during the course of their study? Is it maybe in fact a $15 an hour minimum wage, or maybe even a higher minimum wage than that would have more impact on access and affordability of university than necessarily free tuition? The other one of the other myths and arguments that comes up in this is also that free tuition will help the poorest the most. What we do know is that less affluent students already get significant subsidies and are eligible for significant subsidies, but we also know they're less likely to enter post-secondary education. And as I said, Health Education Strategies did some estimates that in fact, free tuition would direct 3 times as much money to families in the top 25% of income than it would to those in the bottom quarter of income. And so in effect, it acts essentially or mostly as a subsidy to middle class and upper middle class families. And so it helps richer people far more than it helps poorer people, which is to say that there's something else than just tuition that is impacting that first bullet. The reason less affluent students are not coming to PSE is it's less likely that it's tuition based and more likely to be other socioeconomic factors. And I would argue we should be focusing on those if we're interested in opening and increasing access rather than something as narrow as free tuition. And one of my favorite arguments is the classic, but healthcare is free, so why isn't post-secondary education? And this is usually the sort of rhetorical got you argument when all else has failed. But healthcare is an insurance against illness. And you don't know when, if, or how much you need healthcare. And so as a result, this is why we've made a policy choice to pool that risk and share it. PSE, I think, as Carmen has pointed out, has significant social benefits, but it remains also mostly very much a private good. And so I would argue that, in fact, unlike in healthcare, PSE is actually the kind of policy area where if you're looking to increase access, make it more accessible and indeed maybe more affordable, that you should target the support rather than create sort of universal free tuition. So just to sort of sum up, I think tuition is a problem. I think universities are now too reliant on it to fund their operations. But I don't think it's the biggest villain in the affordability or access issues around post-secondary education. I think it would have some negative unintended consequences, some of which Roger pointed out. But I think limiting reliance on tuition also has some benefits. So if your interest is really in increasing access to PSE, I would say you should be focusing on things like poverty reduction. You should be focused on the quality of K-12 for marginalized populations so that they're actually in a place where they are expected to go to some form of post-secondary education, where they're actively encouraged and where the quality of their K-12 education actually prepares them for university. So I will leave that there, and now you can have at us.
All right, so thank you, everybody. I'll just briefly remind you all of sort of the structure of how we're going to be asking questions today. I'll just ask you to use the raise hand function just in your reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question to ask, I'll call on you to unmute yourself. If you would prefer that one of us read the question, just send a chat my way and I'll read it out. But yeah, anybody want to jump in? If nobody jumps in, then I'll start talking and I'm not going to stop talking. So, all right, I can start us off with a question. Any of you can feel free to jump at this one. So in the last provincial election campaign, there wasn't too much talk about strategies with post-secondary education. I believe the New Democrats focused on debt forgiveness. And the SAS party talked a lot about tax credits after graduation. Do you think either of those are good strategies by which to sort of combat problems inherent with post-secondary education and the cost of it? Or
Okay, I guess the idea of debt forgiveness can be important, right? I mean, in the long term, when people have life circumstances where they're not able to achieve ever getting out of debt, having about a year of Jubilee is what they called. Every 50 years, the Israelites supposedly forgave all of the debts. I don't know if I'd recommend that, but I think if you have a prolonged indebtedness of students, and the economic circumstances for whatever reason, or they can't climb out of that debt. And given the fact there are social benefits to having had that education, I think there should be opportunities for debt forgiveness. Maybe not blanket debt forgiveness, but in particular cases, I think that makes sense. The other thing, of course, it's a real drag on the economy over the long term if you have students having to pay the full costs of the university education. And so it seems to me part of the reason students are getting into higher level debts is because the balance, as Tom mentioned, is out of whack in terms of the province providing the funding. So I think that would make sense. Tax credits don't really help you if you're not making any money. So that would be an issue there.
Yeah, I think, you know, what we've seen, and it's actually quite funny. I had, I've sort of picked at the opposition in the last year and a half for, they've had this, they talk a lot about education, but they almost always talk as if education stops after grade 12. And there's virtually no mention of post-secondary education or funding. And part of that is, I get it, we're not a popular segment where, you know, we're those airy-fairy eggheads who do silly stuff and write silly papers and go to silly conferences and all of that. And so there's that kind of you don't win a lot of friends defending universities, maybe in election campaigns. At the same time, I think what we've seen is this transfer of responsibility for funding universities really to the individual. So they're sort of, they're funding students, and then students can take their dollars and go anywhere they want, and you'll get a credit or you'll get tax credits or whatever. And so then it becomes this competition between the universities to get as many of those bums in their seats as possible. And so it fits, I guess, with a kind of market-oriented view that the government has of education. And if we can attract people to U of R, well, then U of R will continue to suffer as a failure to be produce a good product. But I don't, we're already a long ways down the road of viewing a university education as a consumable good that's no different than other widgets that are made. I'm not sure going further down that road actually actually helps us, but it does become a vehicle by which governments of a particular stripe will say, well, this is how we're funding post-secondary education, and the universities will live and die on their ability to attract those dollars from students.
So just a different perspective just sort of flashed in while I was listening to everybody talk. I mean, a lot of this, we're talking about maintaining the institutions. And so, of course, again, it's the way that you frame the question, and having those dollars flow to institutions. Do we need to, maybe this is going too far off the topic, do we need to sort of rethink education? In other words, do we have to let some of the not so great educational institutions fail? Okay, would that, is that actually another way of taking a look at, of rethinking, if you will, education? They compete now, but basically they're subsidized. So you've actually got a lot of not so great institutions where maybe the value of the education isn't as high as what you want, but you get a degree. I mean, is it time to rethink them and let some of them fail?
I think that would make a really...
If they can't control their costs and they're not competitive anymore, should we continue to keep paying those higher costs?
Can I just jump in on that one? I mean, one of the things I noticed with sustainability work, and universities really are in an important place if we're going to achieve the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. Part of the challenge is that universities see each other as competitors. And so collaborative work that could take place between scholars, even if they're just 2 hours apart by a highway here in Saskatchewan, doesn't happen. And the need for collaborative work is really undermined in some ways by that competitive model. The other thing is the precautionary principle. We don't know which scholars are in which universities that have the answers or solutions that we might need. Particularly if it's place-based knowledge, right? The important thing about universities is they are situated in locations, and we don't know where, if we're adapting our production to our local ecosystems, our local livelihood patterns, having those universities and technical institutes in specific places is really, really important. The more that knowledge gets gathered by those universities. So I think there is a real issue if we let them fail, partly because we don't know who, or even philosophy, right? We don't know who if Southern Saskatchewan had no philosophy department, then you're basically saying what, there's nobody in Southern Saskatchewan, because that's where they would get their first degree, is in those local regional institutions. And I think there are some great philosophers in Southern Saskatchewan, but if the University of Regina were to fail, or maybe the University in Kelowna, all of a sudden you've lost that point of getting those brilliant scholars.
Well, I've got a point that sort of builds upon each one of your little answers there. I'll start with one that a student also sent in a question that sort of relates to this. Do you think that like the post-COVID landscape where we're seeing a lot of university move online, that we could see that sort of competition, or not competition, collaboration sort of move forward? I also, to build off on what Carmen said, I think that'd be really interesting to sort of see how universities would compete if like tuition was fully subsidized, and then we saw sort of the creation of private institutions competing with these completely subsidized public institutions. And then sort of another sort of political consideration to make about why maybe in this last election we didn't see post-secondary education be a huge talking point is whether parties view young people and students as a viable voter base. I think you could probably get a lot of young people out to vote if you made promises saying we're going to reduce cost of living for you or cost of tuition for you. But if the parties don't necessarily think that young people want to go out and cast their ballot, that what's the point in including that in our platform then?
I think on the first point, I think there will be some interesting changes that come out of our experience with COVID. I think just as I was saying before we let everybody in and started this, I was in a health policy class at in the Lower Mainland this morning, talking about my research in health policy generally and all of that. I don't think it would have occurred prior to COVID for Hamish Telford to invite me, because wouldn't have thought about the idea that you could do this. I've done the same things. I've taped all sorts of interviews with people for my different classes that I can use both now and maybe in the future. And I think it's there are some interesting things that our sudden switch to a lot of more technology has brought about, including some opportunities for collaboration and the like. And I belong to, I help run a research unit that exists at 2 different universities. We do it, we always argue, in spite of the administration of the 2 universities, not because of it. And we work very hard to keep it investigator driven, because we don't want that competition and anxiety about the two universities have for each other to impact and infect our work. Around the idea about, do you go after youth votes with promises and all of that? I've never been a fan of, we have to promise this group of people this, and that way we'll vote for them. You get their votes for a while. But if you don't deliver, you eventually lose them. And I'm also not sure that, again, I'm not sure that something like a free tuition or tuition freezes or all of that would be that big a vote attractor amongst youth generally. It might be for amongst university youth, but I'm not sure it's going to impact those young people who aren't already in university.
All right.
I was just going to say, I was going to look at, because I think this is where you were going to next, Bronwyn, is looking at the question that Rhett actually posted in terms of, does PSE have a role in increasing class consciousness and class solidarity? And I find that really interesting, especially in light of the American election, because think about it. What's one of the metrics that they use when they were talking about who are you going to vote for? Oh, males, females, white, black, those sorts of things. And what was one of the other things that they always look at? College educated. And it seems that by and large, college educated is a big determination of basically voting Democrat, which would seem to indicate that, that, and in cities where you've got, sort of exposure to different kinds of cultures and those sorts of things. So it's funny. I'm looking at the question and I'm sort of going, yeah, it does have a role in increasing consciousness, if you will. I was going to take the class out of there as well. When you actually have an education, you actually have a broader base and you're more inclusive than you get otherwise. And of course, and it goes back to the things that Tom was talking about. Who goes to school? The people who are already educated and see the benefits of it, and they continue to go through. So in a weird way, yeah, access to post-secondary education is really not so much decreasing our political polarizations, it's actually pulling them apart. I mean, those that go to university are over in one camp, and those that don't are over in another camp. And it's like the two don't meet. Of course, calling one side stupid all the time is really not a good sales pitch to get them to come over to your side, but that's like, I leave that aside. Anyway, I'm sorry, I sort of interrupted in that one just because I thought that was such, like, it's a
Could I just point out though, I mean, there is, I think, a shift in universities that needs to occur, which really has to take seriously the knowledge that's in our local communities, whether it's rural or urban, and look at the idea of citizen scholarship, right? Citizen science, but also citizen scholars. We really rely on, or need to rely more on, those local observers, the indigenous knowledge. And I think once the university kind of goes beyond the ivory tower while still preserving the freedoms of the ivory tower. So extending those freedoms to people in their communities to do knowledge discovery and research. Then I think you'll get a shift where local people say, yeah, I'm not at university, but boy, that faculty member or that student or that class really helped me out. And so, you know, we aren't going to just gut the university because it's generating Democrats or what have you. So I think the university does need to be aware of this. But I think the university needs to see it as an opportunity for extending its reach beyond the campus.
And I think, just to go to that again, sort of blow the horn of Sphero, that kind of community-based research that, and a lot of our work now is focused in rural and small town Saskatchewan. We're preparing for our 20th anniversary, so we've been collecting anecdotes and whatnot from community partners. And what you hear over and over again is the fact that, you know, working with and being supported by this research institute has made big changes in our community, right? Because they helped us solve problems that our community faced. Again, I don't think you can do that if you're going to start saying, well, maybe we let those little universities fail, because they are, I think Roger's point about, they're in a particular place and doing a kind of work that can only be done if you are actually in that place.
All right, it looks like we've gone a little bit over time. If anybody, if you all are wanting to stay on for a little bit more, if anyone has any questions, if not, we can sort of jump into our conclusion here.
Is there a Hannah? Hannah's got her hand up, I think. I see.
Yeah, Hannah, do you want to jump in?
As long as everybody has time.
Yeah, sure. A few more minutes.
Thank you very much.
I say speaking for the other two.
Okay, so I've heard some discussion about subsidizing or creating free tuition for certain fields, like for example, a STEM field, to kind of incentivize people to enter that field more than they would naturally. And I was wondering, I think that it's almost an issue of what's fair versus what's efficient, because I think that this would be like a really cool idea if everybody could be like computer science geniuses and like that kind of stuff. But I think it also kind of forces poor or low income people into entering a certain field. And I don't think that's super fair, but I was wondering if you could kind of comment on that idea.
My own view is I don't think it helps. And again, it's sort of it's always funny because it's usually the kind of policy prescription that comes from the kind of government that says we shouldn't be picking winners in the market, but then they're going to say, here, we're going to adjust this so that because we think these guys are winners, and so we're going to make it free and easy for you to get that education. I want people to be in a university because they want to be in a university. And you know what? If you're studying philosophy, then study philosophy and do it well. And you'll get a job. I know you will. And so, especially with university-based education, I think the attempts to push people in particular directions almost always fail. So
I'm actually originally from the sciences. My whole kind of high school career, people were like, women should be in science. And that lasted a year. So.
Right. And there are women in sciences who are really good at it and who love it. And that's where they should be. But if you're not loving it and you're just there because you've been told you have to make some political point about women in the sciences, then I think that's, you know, that's not helpful.
I guess if I could chime in on this one too. I mean, the structure of the universities is built around curiosity and fulfillment of those questions. And there's no better way to kill curiosity than to send people into areas in which they're not only they don't love it, they aren't curious about it. But the other thing too is, yeah, I study long-term transitions in production systems because I'm interested in moving to a sustainable system. And normally what happens in those critical moments of social change, universities do play a central role because they sit on mountains of knowledge that was deemed to be useless, but now all of a sudden becomes really, really useful. However, in those transitionary moments, it's the actual older parts of the university that are neglected that play a critical role in moving into the new system. So for example, the rise of humanities relied on the older language scholars that had very low standing in the university. Or with the rise of science, it was the scholars who had craft knowledge who could build that new instrumentation. Well, these were the alchemists. These were the scholars who again had a very low standing and yet were central to the rise of science. And similarly with sustainable development, in this case, it is, you know, if we're interested in focusing on human and natural capital and sustaining those, well, of course that relies on the humanities and the social sciences. And yet, if you look at the standing that the humanities and social sciences have relative to STEM, that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about engineering and mathematics. And it's like, well, wait a second. If you want to move into the world of sustainability that focuses on issues of poverty and long-term well-being, and of course, it takes the whole university, right? I mean, it takes a village to move to a new production system, right? It takes all scholars. So there's a kind of pride and hubris. And then also the idea that we should be cross-subsidizing very profitable sectors already. Why is it that we should subsidize big business? Why aren't they putting any money into training? If they want more people in engineering, then they should put money into engineers. Why should the public pay for the private sector's own costs?
I mean, and this goes back to something that Tom was raising before is like, where do you want to focus your solution? And in this case, you know, maybe this is something that we need to start thinking about our primary education in terms of if we think that we want to have more people in those areas, maybe we're not doing as good a job in that K-12 area in terms of giving people the right skills. I mean, basically, yeah, our literacy rates are not bad, but our numeracy rates are like suck. Well, not as bad as some places, but they're not great. And our math skills. And so, you know, is there some work that needs to be done at that level? I mean, God knows I spend a whole lot of money as grandma buying my grandchildren all of these fancy STEM education kits that Kiwi puts together. There's some advertising for them because I want them to have those skills, and I'm not sure that they necessarily get them in the curiosity-based, you know, like spurring curiosity that I think that you probably should. So yeah, rather than solve the problem at the end by trying to entice people into it, you should be enticing them into it by building that curiosity and that base at a younger age.
But don't make them have to decide on what their future career is in grade 6.
Yes, yeah.
Because we are programming students so that they don't choose. They don't even know anything about anthropology or any of these other subject areas, because they fill in little tests to direct them in this area. And again, you know, in a way that's a deliberate design, but it shows this kind of arrogance as to what the future is going to look like. And I really don't know which disciplines are the ones we should be sending students into.
Well,
Best strategy is biodiversity, right? Diverse strategy.
And it should be what you're curious about. I mean, let's face it, when I left high school, what was I going to do? I was going to go to law school because that's where like all of the cachet was and where the money was and whatnot. And I realized after my first year in university that if I would be the most unhappy person in the face of the earth if I actually continued through it and became a lawyer. And that's what you don't want to do. You don't want people to be forced into something where they're just going to be miserable for the rest of their lives.
None of those aptitude tests I took in K to 12 said I should be a political scientist. It was never one of the options that came out. So yeah, I'll leave it there. We should wrap up, I guess.
Yeah, so thank you all so much. I'll pass the mic over to Alanna. I'm gonna just briefly share my screen while she's chatting.
Awesome. Thank you, Bronwyn. All right, and with that, that'll conclude our PPE panel. On behalf of the POLIS executive, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today, and I'd especially like to thank our panelists for their time and their discussion. I hope we were able to share how interesting and engaging a PPE class is. PPE 200 is being offered in the winter semester of 2021, so next semester, by all 3 of our fantastic panelists. Both Bronwyn and I can attest to how great PPE 200 is. We've both taken this course. It works much in the same way as this panel has. So a topic is discussed by each of our three panelists from their lens and their discipline. And then there's usually a quite entertaining discussion at the front of the classroom between the professors on whose perspective is the most important. So I don't doubt that this discussion will be even better virtually. So yeah, registration for PPE 200 is open now. And I also want to say that the U of R does offer a PPE program. It is one of the only handful of universities in Canada who offers a PPE program. Students of this course take 6 courses in each discipline, alongside arts core credits and some open electives. It's a fantastic program. It teaches students different frameworks, and you really get the benefit of learning from an interdisciplinary lens. But I also could be biased. I'd also like to take this time to let everybody know that you can now follow POLIS's events and announcements on Instagram and on Facebook. Bronwyn here put up our QR code so you can scan away. And we also would ask that we are now on Ursu Universe. So to be ratified for the 2020-21 academic year, we need 20 members on our page. So if you're interested, you can sign up to be a member of the club following the QR code as well. We would greatly appreciate it because it would help us to become ratified and get some funding to continue events like this. And with that being said, we hope everybody's having a healthy and successful semester, and we hope to see you all at the POLIS events again. And that's all from us. Thanks, everybody.